And I think the first thing we need to do is give you a breakdown of where we're going this evening, a bit of a roadmap, because that's what the Bible is, isn't it? It's a roadmap that helps us find our way. And we're going to continue to break down the book of Genesis. Last week we introduced the book of Genesis. We considered it as the foundation book of the Bible. And we noted how large a period of history it covers, over 2,500 years. And this week we're going to look at three of the main characters of the book, because there's three men who carry the story from about Genesis chapter 12 to the end of Genesis. They're the patriarchs. That's how we refer to them, the father figures of the nation of Israel. And of course, they're Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then in our Bible theme section, we're going to take a look at the character of God and look at two of his essential characteristics, his knowledge and his power. We'll throw at you a couple of words that you may not hear too often. He's omnipotent and omniscient. And we'll talk more about those words probably in about 20 minutes from now. So let's get right into our first section. And our introductory verse for tonight is from Acts chapter 7. This is from the speech of Stephen, one of the first Christians who lost his life for what he believed. And after giving this speech about the history of the nation of Israel, he was actually stoned to death for his belief in Christ. But look at what he says here in Acts chapter 7. He's talking about the history of the nation. He says, "So Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat the 12 patriarchs." And in a sense, that could be a pretty good summary of Genesis 12 to 50. But what's interesting to us is the word patriarch. It's only used 4 times in the Bible. And here the patriarchs are, of course, the 12 sons of Jacob, the fathers of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. But in reality, it's not just Jacob's 12 sons who are considered patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are also considered patriarchs. And we don't use that word very much these days. It's from the Greek. It's made up of 2 Greek words. The first one is patria, which means a family or a nation. And the other word, archo, means the first. So in other words, a patriarch is the first of a family or a nation. And so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his 12 sons are all the first members of the nation or of the tribes. And we'll see this evening that they're not just the first members of a nation, they're also the first members of another family, a spiritual family that we want to be a part of as well. And so this is another way in which Genesis is really a book of beginnings. So we really want to introduce you tonight to Abraham and his family. And to do so, we should remind ourselves of where we are in history. Now, we put up this slide last week, and we did that to illustrate just how vast an amount of history Genesis covers. There's more years of the history of the world covered in Genesis than there is in the rest of the books of the Bible. About 2,500 years for Genesis and about 1,600 years for the rest of the Bible. And we also noted that by the time we get to Genesis chapter 12, to Abraham there on the timeline, about 2,000 years have transpired. There's only another 2,000 years till we get to Jesus, and only another 2,000 years Jesus to us. So really, by the time we get to Abraham and where we start tonight, we're about halfway from the time between Adam and Christ. And it's at this time that an important family is started. The nation of Israel is born. And what God decides to do is he decides to take a special man and separate him from the rest of the world and to make a promise to him and to his family. And this promise is made in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. And it says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram," now Abram here is actually Abraham. God would change his name later in his life to the name we know him by today. But originally he's called Abram. And God says to Abram, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation. So really the concept is that Abraham had to become a different type of person. He had to leave his family, and he had to become a nation himself. And here's a map we used earlier on in our webinars. It's a simple map of Abraham's journey. He left the territory of Babylon, modern day Iraq, the city of Ur, you can see there in tiny script on the map. And we actually know that Abraham's family were worshipers of false gods in Babylon. But God chose Abraham because he was different than the others. And he took him out of that land, and he took him into the land of Canaan, or what we know today as the land of Israel. Now, I'd love to tell you a lot of things about Abraham, but we're just looking at an overview, kind of a bird's eye view of Genesis. And I would encourage you wholeheartedly to make it a goal to read the whole book of Genesis this month and learn all about the patriarchs. We just have time to look at the main details, and we're going to note where they are in Genesis. So just a really quick overview of Abraham's life. So in chapter 11, he leaves Ur of the Chaldees. He leaves with some of his family, and he gets just over halfway to the land of Canaan, to the city of Haran. And there his father dies in Haran. And he then comes to dwell in the land of Canaan in chapter 12. And Abraham comes there with his nephew Lot, and Abraham is about 75 years old. Sarah is 65 years old. She's always 10 years behind him. And we're told a very important detail about Sarah, that she was barren. She was unable to have children. And as we follow along the story, Abraham and his nephew Lot end up with great herds of cattle, and they decide to separate. And there's the sad story of Lot ending up in the city of Sodom. But really, most of the story about Abraham is about his family. And what we find out is that God makes a promise to Abraham. And the promise is that he would become a great nation, and that he would inherit the land that God had promised him. And all of this depends on having a child. And yet he and Sarah are unable to have a child. They're barren. So in chapter 16, Abram takes another wife, and he has a son named Ishmael. And Abram's about 86 years old at this point. And he thinks this is going to be the son that God will use to fulfill the promises. But that's not God's plan. God tells him that he and Sarah would have a son together. And so by the time we come to chapter 21 of Genesis, the promised son that God had told him about when he left the land was finally born. He's about 100 years old. He'd waited another 14 years after the birth of his first son, Ishmael. And what a huge test of faith this was to Abraham, to believe that God would allow him to have a son when he's 100 years old, when Sarah, his wife, is 90 years old. And even though they lived longer in those days, we're told that Sarah was past the age of childbearing. This child was a miracle. And probably the most well-known event in the life of Abraham comes in chapter 22, where God then says to Abraham, I want you to offer up this son that I've promised you, that you've waited so long for. It's the ultimate test of his faith, the ultimate foreshadowing of God offering up his son as a sacrifice. And you know what? Those 10 chapters there in Genesis, from chapter 12 to 22, are some of my favorite chapters that we read in the Bible during the Bible readings that we do as a family. We follow a plan that lets us read the whole Bible, and I love the chapters in Genesis. But you know what we're really being taught here in these events is that God is looking for a family. And while Abraham is the father of a nation, the nation of Israel, he's also the father of another family. God chose Abraham because he was the kind of faithful man that he was looking for, the kind of faithful man that he envisioned when he created Adam and Eve. And he wanted a whole nation of that type of people. Look at this description of Abraham from the New Testament. It says, the scripture was fulfilled which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Imagine that description. Imagine if that was what God said of you. You're my friend. I would love if that could honestly be said of me. And why did God consider Abraham his friend? Well, because he believed God. He was a man of faith, it says here. When God told him to leave Ur and all his family, and he'd be given a new home, Abraham believed. When God told him that he would have a son when he was almost 100 years old, and his wife was well past the age, Abraham believed. When God said, I want you to offer up your son now that you've waited 25 years for, Abraham believed, we're told, that God would raise him from the dead. And so he's a man of extreme faith, and that made him God's friend. And there's actually 3 spots in the Bible where Abraham is called the friend of God. And the second one here in Isaiah points out that he was to have a family, that Israel, the seed of Jacob, the seed of Abraham, the friend of God, that was the family that God was going to work for. And God was actually looking for an entire family that would have the same faith of Abraham. And so we find out that Abraham is not just the father of the nation of Israel, he's the father of the faithful. And there's this tremendous section in Romans chapter 4 that explains this to us. Look what it says in Romans 4, verse 13. For the promise to Abraham and his offspring, in King James it would say seed, that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. In other words, it's saying God promised to Abraham that he would have a family and that he would inherit the earth because of his faith. And it goes on to say in Romans chapter 4, that is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. So there's a promise that's made to men and women who have the same faith of Abraham. And if you have that same faith, then Abraham is your father. Earlier in Romans chapter 4, verse 11, it says that Abraham is the father of all them that believe. And so you and I can be the children of Abraham. It doesn't matter our nationality. The requirement for being part of this family that God's creating and introducing in Genesis is that we have the faith of Abraham, that we believe in God's promises, that we have enough faith that we are willing to obey and to change our life, to leave behind sin, to make changes in our life, to move to a new situation, to obey God even when it means sacrifice, or to believe God even when it seems totally impossible what God promises to us. And so Abraham is this key character of Genesis. You know what? Abraham is actually mentioned 237 times in the Old Testament. And although that's remarkable, probably what's most remarkable is that he's mentioned 74 times in the New Testament. You can't read the Bible but see the references to Abraham, and it's important to understand the beginning of Abraham in the book of Genesis. But there's 2 other important patriarchs. There's Isaac and there's Jacob. And we've already been introduced to Isaac. He's the son that Abraham and Sarah waited more than 25 years to have. He's the son that Abraham was willing to sacrifice. And just a few quick events from his life. We've talked about his birth in chapter 21. We've talked about his willing sacrifice. You know, Isaac wasn't a child at the time of the sacrifice. He was more likely a teenager or older. And the Bible tells us that he went willingly. And the events of Genesis 22 foreshadow the sacrifice of Jesus himself. Abraham is like God, a father willing to sacrifice his only son, and that makes Isaac like Jesus, a willing son who's willing to give his life in obedience to the Father. Now, we covered that chapter in great detail back in episode number 10. So if you haven't been with us all along, we invite you to go back to the website and review webinar number 10 and look at the amazing foreshadowing of Christ's sacrifice in the life of Isaac. But if we followed on in Genesis, Isaac marries Rebekah. There's a careful manner in which Abraham ensures that Isaac doesn't go back away from the land of Canaan that God had promised. And he goes back, or he brings back for him, a person who shares the same beliefs. And he marries Rebekah, and they have twin sons, Jacob and Esau. And in a way, we're introduced then to the next patriarch. The final episode that's significant in Isaac's life is the one portrayed on the picture here, where he blesses his two sons. And chapter 27 is a fascinating look into the life of Isaac and Rebekah and their two children, Jacob and Esau. But as we saw, there was lessons from the life of Abraham. There's a key lesson from the life of Isaac. And perhaps the most significant point is that just being a part of the natural family is not enough. And look at what it says here in Romans chapter 9. It says, "For they are not all Israel, which are of Israel. Neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children." And why does he say that? Well, he says, because it was in Isaac thy seed shall be called. He's quoting from Genesis. And look at what Paul goes on to say there. He says, "That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed." And so the story of Genesis, where Abraham has a son Ishmael, who's not the promised seed, but his son Isaac is, shows that we need to have the same faith as Abraham. And God's spiritual family will be made up of both Jew and Gentile. And the defining features will be their selection, or our selection by God, and our own demonstration of that same faith that Abraham had. Well, we don't have much time to look at the last patriarch for tonight. And that patriarch, of course, would be Jacob. This is Abraham's grandson and Isaac's son. But one of the most interesting lessons for me from Jacob's life is God's willingness to work with us to develop our character. And so some of the events of Jacob's life show that God was working diligently with Jacob to change him. Remember that Jacob was a twin, and Esau was his older twin brother. And there was a principle in those days that the older son would be given a double portion of the inheritance. And with that came the responsibility to care for the extended family, to act as a priest for the family, to direct them to God. Well, Esau was a man of the field. He wasn't really interested in that responsibility or the birthright. So one day when he's hungry in chapter 25, another fascinating chapter to read, he sold his right to the inheritance for a meal. That's what he thought of his birthright. That's in chapter 25. And in chapter 27, not long after, Jacob deceives his father into giving him the blessing. His father's eyesight was bad. He dressed up like his brother. He imitated his brother. And that caused quite a division in the family. And it forces him to move into Haran in chapter 29. He flees from his brother. He goes back to the family in Haran, where his mother was from. He spends about 20 years in Haran before he returns to the land of Canaan, which he does in chapter 31. And I just want to put up this here, because there's the family tree, the genealogy of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And you see, while he's in Haran, he marries 2 wives, he has 12 children, and they become the 12 tribes of Israel, and thus the great nation of Israel is born. Now, as you can see, there's actually a lot more to Jacob's life, and we're going to have to leave this to next week when we look at one of Jacob's sons, the most prominent of his sons, which was Joseph. And you can see, just as you look at this chart, how much of Genesis is related to Jacob and his family. Note the gaps in the chapter. From 25 to 27 to 29, there's a lot more that you can learn by reading the book of Genesis than this basic overview that we can give you tonight. Well, our time's passing quickly, and we want to move on to the second portion of our webinar. And I may have gone a little bit over time, but I'm actually on to give part 2 tonight, so I arranged with myself to steal a little bit of time from the second half. And we're going to move on to the key Bible themes. Now, last week, Kevin introduced us to the purpose of God. And this week, we want to look at the character of God himself. And it's a topic that we're going to continue to look at for the next several weeks. Now, when you think of God, what do you think of? For me, it's hard to have a visual idea of God. For me, when I think of God, I guess I think more of his characteristics. And the first thing that comes to my mind is God's power. And you know what? In fact, it's that word power or might or strength, which is actually the root of many of the titles of God. One of the most used titles for God in the Hebrew is the Hebrew word El. And that word El refers to strength or might. You might think of another title for God, that God is almighty. And so the basic essence of God is his power. And back in our introduction tonight, we mentioned that there's two words that describe God that we don't use very much in our everyday language. And the first of those words is the word omnipotent. God's omnipotence. And I've put there really what that word means is that God is all-powerful. He is the God, if we're thinking of the Hebrew. Now that big word has a Latin origin, and omni means all, and potent, we can think of that would be something that's powerful. So you can understand the word. And in its most precise meaning, the word omnipotent can only apply to God. Others might be powerful, but only God is all-powerful. In certain situations, you might even have a person who seems all-powerful, but they'd only be all-powerful in that limited context. Only God is all-powerful in every context. And we actually have this word show up in the King James Version of the Bible. It only shows up once, although the idea shows up many, many times. But in Revelation chapter 19, we're told that the Lord God omnipotent reigneth. And that's a vision of a reign on earth where God is all powerful in the future. And how we look forward to that day when God will be the all-powerful ruler on earth. Now, when I think of God's omnipotence, or a demonstration of his power, the first thing that jumps into my mind is the creation of the earth. And Jeremiah had this in mind when he spoke of God's power. This is Jeremiah, the prophet, in chapter 32. He says, "Ah, Lord God, behold, thou hast made the heaven and the earth by thy great power and thy stretched out arm. There is nothing too hard for thee." There's a description of God's omnipotence. And Jeremiah said, the proof of that is when I look around the world, I can see the infinite power of God. And he applied that to his life. He realized that if God could create the heavens and the earth, he could also do great things in his life. And the context of Jeremiah 32 is that Jeremiah reasoned that if God could create the heaven and the earth, well, then God could bring back the people that he was taking captive into Babylon, that God could bring them back to the land. And so Jeremiah made it personal. He said, I understand that God's omnipotence has an effect in my life. We've actually seen a demonstration of God's power already tonight. Look at this verse from Genesis 18. You can see the echo there to Jeremiah 32. Is anything too hard for the Lord? And the context is of God promising to Abraham that he and Sarah would have a son when they were 99 and 89 years old, respectively. Before they had conceived, God said, you will have a son. And as Sarah doubted that, God said, is there anything too hard for the Lord? And the answer, of course, is no. God is omnipotent. God is all-powerful. God can take two people past the age of childbirth and give them a son. And God can work in our lives, too. Now, I had to throw in this picture because when I look at the heavens on a dark, starry night, I can't help but see the mighty power of God. And so this verse here in Psalm 19 is so powerful to me, that the heavens declare the glory of God, especially as I look at that picture and realize that, those dots of light aren't just stars, stars bigger than our sun, but some of them are galaxies full of stars. And in the New Testament tells us that the wonder of the heavens leaves men and women without excuse, that as we look to the heavens or we look to the creation, we should be moved to inquire about God just by seeing the ultimate power surrounding us. And unfortunately, the world's philosophies have offered an alternate explanation, an explanation that leaves God out of the picture. But when I thought about God's omnipotence, about his all-powerful nature, I thought, well, what does that mean? What are the lessons that you and I should take from this? And I thought of just a couple. I thought of, if we recognize God's immense power, well, then we should recognize the power of prayer. How often are we overwhelmed with difficulties in life? We face stresses. We might have lost a loved one. We face a situation in life where we just don't know what to do. Well, the advice of God in the Bible is to cast our burdens upon him, that he'll sustain us, that he has the power to help us no matter the situation in our life. Look at this poetic language in the book of Zephaniah. The Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. God is all powerful. No matter the situation, he can save you. I love the poetic language here. He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love. You know, for me, sometimes the stresses of life are like a loud noise in my head. And God says he can quiet those stresses with his love. He can rejoice over us with singing, the joy that comes with letting God take on our burdens. And so it's not just about God's power, it's about that power that can work in our lives. Another aspect of God's omnipotence is his control over world events. This seems especially comforting in these last 6 months as our world has in many ways been turned upside down. God is in control of everything that's happening, and he's working to bring about a plan that he has for this earth. And perhaps the most interesting way in which God is doing this is the way he controls the leaders of the world. There's this verse in Isaiah chapter 44, and it's talking about Cyrus, who was the king of Persia. He was the king who took over by conquering Babylon. Look what it says of God's control of Cyrus. He is my shepherd and shall perform all my pleasure. God's telling us, I'm controlling the kings of the earth, and they're going to do what I want them to do. And what did Cyrus do? Well, he allowed the Jews to go back and build Jerusalem. He allowed them to go back and build the temple. He actually provided the supplies so that they could build the temple in the days of Ezra after they built the wall in the days of Nehemiah. And the amazing thing is that God is still working behind the scenes today. Just look at this verse here in Daniel chapter. It applies to 2020. The Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. When necessary, God puts in place the rulers that he wants, and he's able to use them to set the stage for the return of his Son. We may not know exactly how, we may not even know why, but we can be assured that no matter what's happening in the world, that God is in control. Well, the other big thing that I think about God is his omniscience. This is another word that we use to describe God. You already know what omni means, it's all, and you probably know what science means, which is knowledge. Put it together, and God's omniscience means that God knows everything. You won't find the word omniscient in the Bible. Perhaps the closest we come is in Psalm 147. Hugely appropriate, this verse. It speaks not just of God's omniscience, but his omnipotence. Great is our Lord, and of great power. So there's God, all powerful. His understanding or his knowledge is infinite. There's no limit to what God knows. This next verse I find quite comforting and challenging at the same time. God knows everything. Thou compasseth my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. There is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. He knows our actions. He knows every word that we speak. In fact, he knows what we are going to say before we say it. He knows our thoughts. And that can be pretty comforting if we're in the right spot. But if we're going astray, then God knows that too. If we're thinking good thoughts and have good intentions, well, God knows it even if we can't accomplish it. God knows it even if others misinterpret what we're going to do. But if we're thinking evil thoughts, well, God knows that too. And a final verse about God's omniscience is this verse in Romans chapter 11. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. You know, God's ways are so far beyond our human comprehension. Well, again, I thought, well, what does this mean? What does it mean that God's all-knowing? How does that apply to your life and to my life? Well, one of the things it means is that we can trust in God. If God knows everything, then why wouldn't we trust his advice? When we come across instruction in the Bible, we should trust it, even if it goes against our natural thoughts or what we think might be the right thing to do. And especially if it goes against popular modern thoughts, which are going so far away from the ways of God. Look at this verse in Proverbs chapter 3. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart. Lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct our paths. You know, just imagine an obstacle course. You had to work your way from the beginning to the end through all sorts of obstacles. Wouldn't it be great to have someone on your side who knows the course inside out, who knows every obstacle and offers you guidance along the way? That's what God's omniscience is, and he reveals that to us in the scriptures. And we think of the power of Bible prophecy. God's all-knowing nature is bound up with the inspiration of the Bible. Because God knows everything, he knows the end from the beginning. And so we're told in Isaiah 46 that God can predict the future. No one else can do that. And in the Bible, there are prophecies that reassure us of what God is accomplishing. He declares the end from the beginning, and at the end of that verse there, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. And isn't it amazing that God has chosen to reveal some of this knowledge to us in the Bible? And finally, I thought of how God's wisdom is infinitely superior to the wisdom of men. Remember the word science in the word omniscience. God's wisdom is so infinitely superior to the wisdom of men. This is a verse that you don't expect to see. It says, the foolishness of God is wiser than men. You never expect to see the phrase, the foolishness of God, because God isn't foolish. But the point is that God's wisdom is so infinitely superior to ours that even the least significant piece of his knowledge is more advanced than the knowledge of our wisest man. Same with his power. The weakness of God is stronger than men. God's ways are infinitely superior to our understanding. And that's the respect that we should have for God. If the world presents any contradiction to what we're told in the Bible, there's no contest to whose wisdom we should accept. And when you think about those two characteristics, and the characteristic that God is immortal, from beginning, no end, from everlasting to everlasting, the characteristic of God is almost incomprehensible. But you know what? It's also, at least for me, very comforting. And I want to finish our webinar this evening with a verse that gives me great peace of mind, no matter what situation in life. And it's a verse that combines the two great attributes of God. Oh, I skipped over there. God's omnipotence and his omniscience. Look at the comfort of this verse in Romans chapter 8. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. What shall we say then to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? You know, whatever's happening in your life, whatever's happening in my life, God can make it work out for good. All things work together for good to them that love God. And why can God do this? Well, the first reason is that God knows everything. God knows exactly what we need. God knows the end from the beginning. He knows what the end result of situations in our life are going to be. And secondly, he's all powerful. He's in control. He can change the course of his life. He can intervene when necessary. He might send trials to make us stronger. He might send difficulties to correct us. But we know that whatever happens in our life, if we put God first, if we love God, then they will work out for our good in the end. And that's an amazing thing, friends, to have that understanding of the character of God. So we hope you'll continue with us. We hope you learned something this evening, and we invite you to join us next week as we look at another Bible Basics webinar. We're going to wrap up the overview of the book of Genesis by looking at the life of Joseph and the last chapters of the book of Genesis, and just give you a little bit of a taste for what's contained there. And again, I encourage you, if you can, to try to read Genesis for yourself in the coming days. And then in our Bible themes, we're going to continue looking at God's character, and specifically how some of the attributes of God are proclaimed in Exodus chapter 34.